there are so many competing, I don't even want to use the word interests in the school system, but there are so many demands put on teachers and administrators. The number of things that they're required to teach and that their students are supposed to learn is massive. And anybody in the education system will tell you that the standards that are supposed to be covered are much, much deeper and wider than students can possibly get in the course of their K-12 education. So where it becomes important and where the opportunity is to connect environmental literacy to the education system is by showing teachers and administrators that as they're building their programs, these connections to environmental literacy benefit their students from an academic perspective as well. And so we spent several years doing research on how environment-based education, giving students real-world experiences, local, not just out of their books or on a lab table, but letting them explore the world around them, actually benefits a number of things. It benefits their academic achievement. And so we have evidence that it helps students do better on standardized tests, not that standardized tests are the end all and be all, but they are an indicator. And when we're looking at getting it into schools on the ground, things like achievement on standardized tests or on the standards themselves become a very, very important aspect of the way administrators and school principals and teachers think about this. Of course, parents are interested in that too. So that's really one of the keys to getting it in the door in the school system, is showing teachers and educators across the state that it can benefit their students. They're not just learning about the environment, but because the engagement we see when students are out looking at the real world and studying their local environment, that engagement becomes critical. And we have evidence that attendance rates improve when the teachers are using an environment-based approach. And we know student attitudes improve. And it's pretty simple, actually. It just really is telling us that if students are interested in and engaged in what they're learning, they're going to do better. I mean, I don't think that's surprising to anybody, but that usually isn't all that controls the way education works. But we have strong evidence of that from across the country, actually, that it benefits the students and it benefits the teachers, and it benefits them not just academically, but behaviorally and attitudinally. And so those aspects are really the critical ways to open the door into the education system. In terms of getting it to be meaningful and implemented in the schools, not just the administrative kinds of decisions, but actually teachers taking this on, it takes a lot of input because there are a lot of competing interests. They have Common Core standards to deal with, and they have history, and they have health and science, all of these different standards that are competing for a teacher's time and obviously for a student's time in the day. So we really can't ask teachers, and we don't ask teachers. That's why we talk about environment-based or environment as context, because we're not really asking teacher to spend an hour on Friday doing something about the environment. It simply doesn't work. There's never enough time for that. But what teachers can do is connect it to what they're already responsible for teaching. So when they're teaching science, they can do scientific investigations about their local environment. Or when they're teaching math, not just doing math about environmental things, but really applying math to local environmental problems. So if they're looking at water quality, looking at the way some investigation they're doing would affect the the level of pollutants in water in a creek or in the lab, but it really gives the teachers a chance to do their traditional job on all of those disciplines, but in a way that also gives students the opportunity to learn about the environment. And that's why you get the engagement. That really is a complex question because teachers are uh, teachers are really responsible for teaching the way it's taught in the frameworks, but the frameworks are translated for the teachers. So very few of them read the framework documents any longer. When back in 98, when the first science framework was, when the 98 framework was developed after new 1998 science standards, that framework was about 150 pages long. The current science framework is almost 2,000 pages long. So teachers don't read every word in the framework. Obviously, some of them do, but it becomes the job of the instructional materials publishers to translate the material. That's why it's so important when the state board is requiring that environmental literacy and environmental principles and concepts are built into the instructional materials for science and social studies and health and art, and now coming math in about a year and a half. So, so teachers use those instructional materials, but especially when you're talking about new teachers and inexperienced teachers, that's what they tend to rely on, is the instructional materials that their school districts have adopted. And then they can, as they get more experienced after 2, 3, 4, 5 years, then they begin to expand their teaching practices. And so even though they might have done something that was directly out of the book for the first couple of years, by the time they get more experienced and they've been teaching for 5 or 10 years, I know that sounds like a long time, but this is a long process. But when they have more experience and they're comfortable managing their students and taking students outside, which can be a big challenge. It's hard for teachers to manage, you can imagine 30 or 40 students outside exploring. So they have to build a real strong relationship with the students, and teachers have to build their skills at working with students on these kinds of exploratory environment-based activities. But they do that. It just takes them time and experience, just like everything else, but it takes them time to just learn how to use all the tools that they have. The teacher development, the pre-service education system is of course limited in what it can expose teachers to, because they're not working with young students all the time. They're really in classes sitting in front of projectors and lectures like the kids in K-12 system are. So they have to learn it on the ground. They have to really have the experiences. They have to know that the state expects them to do these things, because that's what's expected now, is that the kids are getting some environmental literacy exposure. An example of that, I think that's worth pointing out, is the science framework in California. And this, I think, is under-recognized, but it's a high priority in the framework. And it's a high priority to people who really know how the next generation science standards are supposed to be taught. One of the key instructional shifts that's called for in that framework is that science is supposed to be done through investigations of things that are relevant to students' communities and to the students themselves. So it's no longer, let's pick a chemistry experiment because the teacher thought that was interesting. Next generation science standards call on the teachers to give them real world, meaningful experiences that mean something to those students locally. And really, actually, one of the big shifts over the last 5, 6 years now has been a massive shift in all of these disciplines. And really, it's been a big push by the State Board of Education and the Department of Education to get students more engaged civically in their communities. And so you see calls for civic engagement in science, in the science framework. You see it in the history social science framework. You see it in health again, and in art, and in math as well. You see now in these new frameworks that the State Board of Ed is calling on teachers to engage students in their community. So it's not just to go do a research project because that creek that runs by the school looks like it's polluted. Yeah, that would be a nice science activity, but it's actually to engage the students in doing something about it. And so, in fact, one point that very few teachers are probably aware of yet is that the State Board of Ed and the State Department of Ed have adopted a state seal of civic engagement, and students can get that civic engagement seal on their diplomas out of high school. So it's a push to actually formalize a process to say students engaging in their community is important, and the environment's a great way to do that. And so, frankly, I think the environment's, it's not just that it's intriguing to the kids, but it's actually something that they can get engaged in because they can see that they can make a difference. So that's another key policy shift. And it's another important way that the state policymakers are pushing to get not just environmental literacy, but civic engagement. So when you hear about problems related to environmental justice in communities across the state, then you see a chance for students to get deeply engaged in actually helping their communities and getting engaged with not just planning projects, but also in getting engaged with decision makers in the school system or in their local communities. So it's interesting, we're working with a district in Southern California where one of the local environmental health problems that they discovered, and is actually an important basis for some of the science teaching that they do, is a perchlorate pollution problem. There were factories in this community, and perchlorate leached into the water table, and that's there. And a large number of households in the community are affected by that perchlorate contamination. So the school district actually has the students engaged in that problem. So all of those things are important, but the policy becomes really important. And then because it ties to the state standardized tests, it gets reinforced. So all of these pieces have to really come together. So you need the standards and the framework. You need things like the state seal for civic engagement. You need teachers to be receiving professional development that's deep enough so that they're aware of these policies and aware of how they can effectively implement them.